Thanks, Tracy. You're far too kind to me. I wasn't abandoned. Although that is one of my deepest, darkest secrets, and I don't tell anybody that, so consider yourselves lucky. I really am excited to be here today. I was a little shocked when I got the invitation to speak, but I was really grateful for the opportunity. So before I even start, I really do have to shout out the people in the room who really should be up here with me giving that, and Dreva's right here in the room. She's the chair of the Utah VOAD. So many of our VOAD partners and agencies are here in the room. We also have some of our great FEMA partners here as well. So anyway, thanks you guys for being here as well. Tracy kind of introduced my background, and thank you. Like I said, Tracy, you're far too kind. I was able to be the chair of the VOAD in Wyoming for 2 years before I moved here. And during that tenure, it was really interesting because somebody had this great idea while we were in Idaho at a conference. They were like, let's make it a multi-state VOAD. And we're like, oh, well, okay. And then we did. And now I'm here, and I'm kind of a president of like an 11-state VOAD. And I don't really know how that happened, but it happened, and I'm really glad it did, because the miracles that have happened because of that are really immeasurable. And that's kind of what I want to talk to you guys about tonight, is kind of how that process has come and what that means for each of you. As a shameless pitch, the next conference for our Mountain West Conference is happening in Bozeman, Montana in April. So come join us. It's an incredible conference. It has been for the last 2 years. We expect nothing less in the next year. So today, we really just want to try to get our heads wrapped around a couple key principles. So we want to understand what VOAD is. How many people here actually know what a VOAD is? We say VOAD, okay. We're not allowed to talk in acronyms, and I've already failed like 60 times. So VOAD is Volunteer Organizations Active in Disaster. So we'll get more into what that means here in a little bit, but I really want to make sure that we can unpack what exactly the structure of a VOAD is and how that works with you guys, what the mission and capabilities of our VOAD partners are, what it actually means in a disaster, right? What actually works. I think sometimes we talk about a lot of great ideas that we think are going to be great, but to actually see them come to fruition is a much different story. So we're going to try to unpack that. And then how can we actually strengthen those relationships? So I've worked with a lot of different emergency managers. So how many people in here are with a voluntary organization active in disaster? Who's affiliated with a VOAD agency? Raise your hands high for me. Okay, who here works with emergency management? Great, equal parts, give or take. I like that. Thank you for being here. I've worked with a lot of emergency managers over the years. When I was in Wyoming, I actually got to have personal relationships with all 27 of them, which was quite a unique experience because no one emergency manager is like another. And one of the things we want to do is try to help guide your perception of VOAD to be accurate more than anything, just so we can communicate the best way possible. So what is the mission of VOAD? I love putting up all of these annoying words because it's going to help illustrate something here in a second. So the mission of National VOAD, it's really focused on coordination, collaboration, communication, and there's 4 C's. What's the last one? Coordination, cooperation. That's the other one, cooperation. Okay, so what that means is that we really try to bring together a coalition of VOAD agencies to support during a disaster. So there's about 57 partners nationally, and they look like this. So they're all over the map. The nice thing is how is it set up? How VOAD is set up is the coalition exists nationally and includes all of these different states, right? So we meet every year as a conference to really try to share best practices because the mission essentially is the same. We all want to work together during disasters to help do good things for people who need it. When we break it down a little bit more, we talked about the Mountain West VOAD, that 11-state VOAD, and these are the states involved with that VOAD. So we include Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, North and South Dakota, Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah. It's been an incredible thing, and why a lot of people ask us why we decided to build an 11-state VOAD. The answers for us were very, very simple. A lot of us share the exact same threat, hazard, and risk assessment, right? We deal with a lot of wildfires. We have a lot of rural areas. There may be flooding threats. There may be earthquake threats in Utah. Obviously, that's a huge buzzword for us. But we wanted to make sure that we could support each other during times of disaster, because the other similarity we see is that there's a lot of organizations out there, but because we're so rural, they may not be present in every single state, right? I came from Wyoming, which we just broke 500,000 people like 4 years ago, which was a really, really big accomplishment for us. So we don't have that many VOAD agencies that are represented there, right? In Utah, Southern Baptist is one of the biggest organizations, and they weren't in Wyoming. And forming this coalition helped us gain resources from VOAD partners that may not sit in our exact state, but would still cover and have responsibility over those areas, which makes sense, right? I mean, it only makes sense because disasters know no boundaries. It's kind of our phraseology for that, so why not combine? The nice thing being here in Utah, though, is that each state also has its own VOAD. So like I said, Joab is the chair here, a lot of your VOAD partners sitting here in the room with you, and their entire mission is to help you, emergency managers, do your job. That's what they're here for, and we'll kind of unpack how they do that here. Within Utah, they also break it down one more level into regional VOADs, and they follow the emergency management regions. So if you're in Salt Lake, you would be affiliated with Region 2 VOAD. North, you'd be affiliated with Region 1, right? So that's kind of how the structure is broken down. And like I said, here's all these different organizations, right? So when we think of VOAD, I think the obvious ones kind of come to mind, right? Everybody thinks of the Red Cross. I know I'm with that elephant in the room, but there's a lot more than just Red Cross, right? So I mentioned Southern Baptist earlier. The LDS Church plays a huge role here in Utah and throughout the country, and especially throughout the world. We have Habitat for Humanity, Mennonites, Scientology, the Adventist, UMCOR. The number is 57 of these partners nationally. When I started with Red Cross 2.5 years ago, I was sitting in a meeting and they say, Amber, I think we need you to be the VOAD chair for Wyoming because there's nobody else to do it. I said, what is VOAD? So they're like, what's this? It's this coalition of organizations. And I couldn't understand, and I saw a graphic like this with all of these logos up there, and I said, I don't know what that means. For somebody who doesn't necessarily have the experience and the expertise in VOAD, it's really hard to understand what all of this means. So I'm going to try to help us out, and I'm going to give you an illustration this way. We think of disasters as a point in time, the boom over here on the left side, right? Let's consider that this is our timeline of disaster. So this horrible thing happens, whatever it is. Let's say there's a flood, let's say there's a wildfire. So this thing happens, and what happens over the days and months that follow that? As emergency managers, you could probably answer that, right? It's like you're going to activate this COP, the guns and the hoses are going to show up, right? You have your first responders, you guys are going to set up your EOC, your incident command, and you're going to go to work, right? That's why you guys have the jobs that you do. And the question is, where do the VOAD partners sit and support you? To me, it makes a lot of sense when you pan it out. Now, please know, of course, not every VOAD organization is listed on this. It wouldn't fit on the wall chart, so there is that caveat. But I think it's really interesting to understand that when you look at, the day 1, day 3, kind of this second responders, you're looking at organizations like Red Cross, right? We do sheltering, that's what we do. Salvation Army, Southern Baptist, they feed, right? That's what they do. They've kind of found their niche. Those are the ones that become the most obvious, in the forefront of people's minds, right? I mean, that's life support that happens during a disaster that has to be there. However, we also find that it doesn't end there, right? When we look at disaster, we look at this disaster cycle, so prepare, respond, recover. I think so much we get so obsessed with this sexy part of response that we forget to see the rest. And that's what this shows us. So what happens 2 weeks where you're starting to get so many spontaneous volunteers or so many donations that you don't know what to do with? The answer is there's an organization that does that, right? Adventist Community Services are some of the national leaders in donations management. They are incredible. You should see what they can set up. I mean, we've called them in before, and they come in with their trucks and their stacks, and they're color coding, and before you know it, they've pretty much set up their own store to get people what they need. I can't do that. As emergency managers, you need somebody to do that, so here's your resource, right? As we move down the line, we see muck out and debris removal, right? There's trees and streets, there's mud in basements. Who comes in to do that? Well, these are just a couple, but LDS Charities is oftentimes right there with their Mormon helping hands. UNCOR is right there, Team Rubicon, right? That's the group of our veterans who have come back to make an organization. They put them in a heavy equipment operator and they will clear streets faster than anybody, right? This is their niche. As we move even further out, you can't really see the timeline there, but this is 6 months, even to a year down here at the end. Did you know that there's organizations out there that can help completely rebuild houses? When I started, I had no idea, right? The news doesn't necessarily cover that part of it, right? The tragedy, the flood waters rising, the flames creeping in, all of that stuff's done. But the recovery is not over yet. You look at Hurricane Katrina, 10 years later, right? Last year marked the 10-year anniversary. They were still rebuilding houses in Louisiana. That's crazy. But these are the partners that help make that happen. This is a visual that I think is really important as we consider what VOAD can do for you as emergency management, and as VOAD partners, what our responsibility is to help support. I think sometimes there's always, I'm a very transparent person. The more you guys get to know me, the more you'll find that out. We mentioned the 4 C's earlier, the one that I couldn't remember right off, which I apologize for, but we always joke that there's a 5th C, and that it's competition, right? That it's like we all want to do good work, and Red Cross thinks they're the biggest and the best, and they do this, and my food's better than theirs. We don't care, right? We shouldn't care. That's why communication needs to happen now. And the great thing is that when we work with our partners and figure all of that stuff out beforehand, we find out that we can support you as emergency managers to actually get that job done. So, what can VOAD actually do for you guys as emergency managers? Well, I kind of picked out 3 of the big ones. So the first one, we are an excellent return on investment. Our ROI is like through the roof. And let me explain to you why through the next 2 points. Number 2, they can do the job. They can do the job. Our volunteers throughout these agencies have been doing this for decades. And it's incredible to see them come to work, to trust Habitat for Humanity to come in and say, we need to know how much lumber we need to get to build these houses. They know the answer. We don't have to have a contractor come in to do that. So they're able to do that, and it really offers financial relief, right? Because they can do that job so efficiently, you don't have to necessarily hire contractors. Some things, of course, you'll have to hire contractors for, but a lot of that work, VOAD agencies can help support you through that. We also offer case management and financial assistance. What does that mean? A lot of times during disasters, FEMA will come in, there may be a declaration, and people will get their FEMA checks, right? Well, there's agencies that can help complement the funds that they get from FEMA. And we won't get into the details of what qualifies here and that and whatever, because all that changes. But the principle is that there's agencies that can help provide financial assistance. And the last one, which I think is probably one of the most important, is that we contribute to the cost match that will be laid on you as a jurisdiction, as a government entity. So when we look at, once that Stafford Act is implemented, you guys, as the jurisdiction, will be responsible for 25% of the cost, and government picks up the other 75%. What our volunteers are able to do is offset that cost match, because every single volunteer hour or equipment hour used contributes back to that. And our VOAD agencies are trained on how to record those hours. When you look at the numbers, I was trying to find the numbers from the Colorado floods, and I don't remember exactly, but the financial burden lifted through VOAD partners was in the millions. I mean, I think it was over $1 million anyway. That's a lot. That's a lot when you look at now the responsibility that's not laid on your jurisdiction necessarily, which why not use us, right? We're not that bad to work with, I promise. So what will you actually see if some of our VOAD agencies come to work? And I should probably distill down a word that I think probably needs some clarification. We were talking about this in the hallway earlier. People like to use the word activate VOAD, right? What does it take to activate a VOAD? And I would argue it's a bad way to phrase it, right? VOAD, when we use that word, it's really a description of a coalition of agencies that come together to try to do good work, right? I mean, VOAD doesn't show up to the disaster. Red Cross shows up to the disaster, and Scientology shows up to the disaster, and the LDS Church, and all these different agencies will show up to support in their own capacity. VOAD is a word that's really used to describe what we do before all of that enduring, to help us coordinate, communicate, and just get all of that best practice stuff out of the way and done. VOAD does not activate. As emergency managers, you would have the opportunity to call the Red Cross and ask for help, or call the Southern Baptist to help you feed. Now, that's not to say that you couldn't call Joeva and say, Joeva, I've got a problem, and I need you to help me solve it. Who do you know that can do that thing? And she's gonna be like, oh, well, I know who does that thing, and then that thing is gonna show up over there, hopefully. I mean, at some point, but that's what happens when you try to get support from VOAD agencies, and it works. When you make that phone call, what could you actually see beyond just the sheltering, the feeding, the muck out, the financial support, damage assessment, debris removal? Well, two things in particular that I want to mention. The first is what we call a multi-agency resource center. A multi-agency resource center, or a MARC, is, envision it as a one-stop shop for disaster clients who need help. So each volunteer organization would come together to basically put their services on display, if you will. They come in, there's a check-in process, you get vetted through that process, and then they're able to work with each agency based on their needs. We have seen this model pop up countless times over the last several years throughout the country, with varying limits of success probably, but more often than not, it has completely changed how services are given to clients. I think it's important for me to mention this, just because this is something that, it's a force multiplier. I don't really like using that buzzword, but truly in this case, that's exactly what it is. It does look kind of like a FEMA disaster recovery center, right? Sometimes they can kind of exist in tandem and support one another, but it really is designed to do nothing more than just be a one-stop shop. One of the biggest frustrations we see from disaster clients is that they'll come in and they'll have to sit down with the Red Cross and do all this case management. And then they'll go over to the next guy in Southern Baptist and be like, oh, well, to qualify for this, you have to fill out this form. And they do it all again. And they go to the next guy, and then they go to the next guy. And then FEMA comes in, and then they have to do it all over again. But having a MARC really limits that process. It streamlines it to make it easier for the clients to get what they need. The second thing that you very well may see and should see after a disaster is what we call a long-term recovery group, or an LTRG. This is basically a collection of people supported by VOAD agencies, community partnerships, designed to help bring relief to people in need. And I won't go into any major detail, but it's basically a committee designed to process different requests and divvy up the assistance as it's needed. But this long-term recovery groups are powerful because they support the recovery in the long term, right? They're really kind of that more sustainable model. Instead of just relying on one agency or another to really facilitate that recovery, it works as a group to be able to do that. You look at Colorado floods again, and some of their long-term recovery groups are still they're still going, they're still working on different projects to help bring and bolster recovery in those different communities. Are there any questions so far? I didn't mention at the beginning that you're welcome to interrupt me at any time, but is any questions at this point? Yeah, please.
How would you, or could you incorporate your MARC in your EOC, in your long-term recovery plans? Would you want to pull them in to your EOC at an EOC level? How would you see that function?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is, would you want to integrate a mark into an EOC? The answer is kind of. I mean, it's like you would, one of the things we'll mention is that we really emphasize having a VOAD representative in your EOC, and that would kind of be your link between the two. I mean, if you were to visualize a mark in your mind, you could see this entire room, this entire area filled with agencies offering help. So it's almost like a fair, right? I mean, it's when you do a preparedness fair, that's what it would look like. So as for its tie into an EOC, that would typically be facilitated through a VOAD representative sitting in that EOC, kind of acting as the liaison between the two. Similar with the long-term recovery group, the mark would happen before the long-term recovery group would happen, right? I mentioned that one first because chronologically, again, it happens first. By the time a long-term recovery group is assembled and put together, typically EOCs are not really in full activation anymore, but that correlation and that communication that happens with the VOAD still facilitates that process. Does that make sense? Yeah, please.
As I look at it from here, I look at it as a branch overlay. That branch director being that connection back into the command structure, but allowing it to function with its independent needs, it's going to have its schedule and its people. It's going to be so different than a lot of the other pieces of the puzzle that branch, from my perspective, works really well. And it's going to also transfer over into our disaster recovery managers and our disaster recovery task force much easier than the past.
Yeah, absolutely. The other way to look at it is that a lot of EOCs anymore are set up by ESFs, right, emergency support functions. A lot of VOAD activities fall under ESF number 6, which is Mass Care, Health, and Human Services. They introduced a new ESF though, and that's recovery, which is it number 15? Am I right? 16? Am I telling lies? Okay, I don't think so. There's a recovery emergency support function now. And Brandon, please.
The National Disaster Recovery group has their own RSS, so they have recovery support functions. It's set up the way the NRF, so they have their own recovery framework, and there's separate RSS that fall under the recovery. So that's another it's a separate entity for those guys.
It's really ESF 14.
Right. Great. Perfect. Thank you for the clarification. I appreciate that. Yeah, Brooks.
This is something that when you ask about whether it should come to an EOC, you have to remember that a mark is designed for individuals to come up and not only receive services, but to receive stuff. So it can very well be considered a Walmart of disaster where people will show up and say, I need water, I need diapers, I need formula, I need emotional and spiritual care, and I need a voucher, and I need some bedding.
So they go to shop.
It's
It's
a
an
one-stop
end
shop.
user to come in and shop for support and service.
It's like a one-stop shop for people to come in and try to meet their immediate unmet need caused by that disaster. So when you ask whether you want that at the EOC or not, I would say you have to really consider whether you want all the people coming to your
Right,
EOC.
right, in that situation, you wouldn't.
No, you wouldn't.
Right.
Exactly. But to have somebody from the VOAD sitting in the EOC to help give you data and let you know, get the situation awareness and what's going on, that is something that you would want. The second point I would want to mention is, the gentleman up front mentioned ESF 14, which used to be the community long-term recovery is what it used to be called. That's where it gets complicated because people use long-term recovery groups interchangeably. And when Amber's talking about long-term recovery groups, these groups are grassroots. They kind of self-generate. The VOADs help support them to meet the needs of the individuals and households. We're not talking about, where's the firehouse going to go? If we're going to rebuild the school, where's the school going to go? That's more of the RSS that Brandon was talking about. LTRGs, when the VOAD talks about it, we're talking about finding ways through case management to filter the resources to those who need it, who are the most vulnerable, for people, not communities.
Yeah, exactly. Does that? Thank you. So Brooks and Brennan are not that I'm play favorites, but they're my favorite FEMA guys that I know. So they help solve all of my tough FEMA questions. So did that help clarify difference for everybody? Perfect. Thank you, guys. Okay, so from the other side of the fence, what is it that emergency management can do for VOAD? I think a lot of times as VOAD agencies, we kind of have our wish lists of what we'd like our emergency managers to know, just like you guys have the same thing for us. Towards the top of the list are probably these three things. So number one, we really like it when emergency managers help us know and understand their jurisdictional specific protocols and processes. Because even though we've been doing this for decades, each area can be different. So this really speaks to the importance of us coming together beforehand, participating in exercises, meeting one-on-one to have that honest conversation of you guys asking us and kind of drilling me, Amber, what is it that Red Cross can actually bring to the table? And then that way we can know within those processes and protocols what we can actually do for you. The more we know beforehand, the better off both sides of the fence will be. Second, we really want to help facilitate that relationship building through exercises and sharing of plans. Sometimes I've been handed an emergency operation plan before, and they're like, Amber, would you mind looking through this and seeing if Red Cross is still okay with that? And I found Red Cross's name in places where I was like, we're doing what, for who, and when? And it's miscommunication. It's just having clarity of expectations. Not that the emergency manager was wrong, I just didn't know. So being able to have that conversation beforehand, and don't be afraid to ask for it either. Have that, call Joab and say, what is it that, that you guys can provide, share your plans with her so that way they can be vetted through both sides. And then third, it's really important, this sounds almost kind of like an amateur duh kind of statement, but keep us informed of what's going on. Yes, that means exercises or, if you have monthly meetings or something like that, but more than that, it's if a disaster is happening, don't be afraid to call and ask for help. One of the things we saw in Wyoming, and I'll tell a lot of stories about Wyoming because that's where a lot of my VOAD experience came from, but one of the things we saw is that disasters would happen, and it was like we had trained Pavlov's dog to do nothing but call Red Cross. So Red Cross, as a result, tried to do everything, and we can't, right? Red Cross does a lot of great stuff, but it's only one piece of the puzzle that can be accented when we bring all of these other agencies to the table. But they weren't used to calling VOAD and say, hey, this fire is happening up, Mill Creek Canyon, and we need XYZ support. Do you think you can help? Instead, they just kind of isolate that. And we challenge you guys as emergency managers, don't be afraid to call and ask for help, because that's what we do. We're able to do it. A lot of people also think that, it's not big enough to call VOAD. Well, maybe, but we can see what we can do and have that discussion, because we don't want you guys to think that there's certain trigger points. That's why that discussion needs to be had, so we can support you the best way possible. Okay, so this is my facetious slide, by the way. I figure I have to throw one of those in. So what doesn't work during a disaster? Doing everything on your own, both for VOADs and emergency managers, not communicating, withholding services from disaster-affected clients, meeting partners on the doorstep of disaster. How many times has that happened, right? Something goes down and you're like, I need to call this person, and they're like, hi, I'm Amber with Red Cross, and this is a bad day. Let's try to minimize that as much as possible, and assuming we know what the other side wants from us. So all of that's the bad stuff, right? So what actually does work? Well, we'll start with emergency management. What does work is please invite us to the table in your EOC. What you can expect from a VOAD representative at the EOC is that when you get those wonky calls coming in saying, look, we've got this and we need to get food to this isolator, whatever it is, that VOAD person can now be at that table and say, hey, we know a guy, right? We know a group that can help do that, and they can help solve those complex problems. We're lucky in Utah. VOAD has a chair at the state EOC. So we're exceptionally grateful for that opportunity. And, they're actually pointing to we have 2 seats, which is wonderful. At your local jurisdiction, we would love to have the same opportunity to work with you there. It's also important that you communicate clear expectations to us. The only way that we can help get you what you need is to know what that expectation is. It's also important that we share pertinent information. To me, the most obvious is preliminary damage assessment information. Red Cross does damage assessment, and then the city's out doing damage assessment, and then everybody's doing damage assessment. Can we all just share damage assessment information? And it seems so obvious, but it seems so limited sometimes. But having a plan and making sure that everything can flow well beforehand. And you can see that that's listed on both sides because it goes to both sides of that fence. But that's critical. We also really encourage people to refer to a coordinated disaster response plan and protocols. Right, the more predictable it can be, the better. We always quote Eisenhower saying that plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. If we can both be involved and support each other through that process, we're all better. Similarly, coordinating the collection of records and using appropriately. Right, we talked about that 75-25 cost match and that we can really help you. That doesn't do any good if you don't have a way to take those records and actually use them. Again, it seems really obvious. We'll talk about a case study here where that kind of happened, but kind of keep that idea in your back pocket as well. And then, of course, we have our marks and our long-term recovery groups. And then, of course, for both of us, utilizing the expertise of our FEMA partners and our VOADs. They bring more to the table than I think a lot of us would care to admit, but they're really, really good at what they do. So being able to use their expertise is invaluable. From the VOAD side of things, what works for us that we can do? It's really important for us to be trained and confident in the incident command system. And I know that seems, again, really, really basic, but we know that as emergency managers, that's the language you speak, right? I mean, when you talk about the ops section or, the liaison officer, that's like a second language to you guys. And for us as volunteers, it's really important that we can communicate with you in your language. So we take that responsibility on so we can help support you in that. Similarly to expectations from you, we want to make sure that we are clearly setting our expectations and what our capabilities are. One of the sad things to me with a lot of agencies is we always say, oh yeah, we can do that. Oh, no problem. We can set up however many shelters or feed however many people, but that doesn't do any good for any of us if it's not realistic and accurate. So we can't overemphasize the importance. Even if it's not that pretty of a picture, it's like if half of my volunteers just walked out the door, they're all deployed to Texas or somewhere, because everybody always gets deployed to Texas. It's like we want to be able to say, you know what, we can't actually do that right now. And that almost seems like a swear word to us. It's like we never want to say no. But sometimes you just have to say, right now, we're not able to do that. But honesty is definitely the best policy with this. We already talked about the coordinated response plans and protocols. It's also important for us as VOAD agencies to maintain excellent records, right? If we're going to put our money where our mouth is, saying that we can help our emergency managers, you all, meet that cost match or help offset that, we have to be able to do it, right? We need to be able to get them the documents that can actually help support that. And then, again, the marks and then our FEMA partners. So lists like this are kind of interesting to me because they seem so obvious, but sometimes it's the obvious things that we need to be reminded of. Yeah, Julian.
What's a VAL?
Yeah, a VAL, sorry, I broke my rule again. A VAL is a voluntary agency liaison. So it's a FEMA position. For Region 8, it's Brooks. He's awesome. For Utah, it's Ken. You literally have both of them in the room right now, and they're both incredible. So I know them both personally. I actually trust them with my life. So thank you for being here. Okay, this is probably my favorite comic of all time. Who's a Calvin and Hobbes fan? I thank you. Is this not perfect? Isn't that sometimes exactly how a disaster feels? Right? It's like you face plant, you trip, you're dying, and at the end, it's like, well, I think we made it. Right? we think we made it. So I use this slide to transition into a case study that felt a whole lot like this to a T. All right, Lusk, Wyoming. I'll do this in a quick, probably 10 or 15 minutes to run through this, but in my time, I've learned that case studies have done more to help me understand what actually happens than anything else. So, some background. Lusk, Wyoming is a little baby town on our eastern side. You can see the population there. It was a whopping 1,500 people, 1,447. It's tucked away. It's a gateway to the Black Hills, to Devil's Canyon. Incredible for hunting. Me and my boss at the time, Spencer with Red Cross, were driving through probably in July or August of 2014 saying, wouldn't it be awesome to just retire here, work the part-time emergency management position, nothing ever happens, it's beautiful, it's God's country here, all of Wyoming is God's country if you're in the northern part, and this would be perfect, right? Well, fast forward a year, and that wasn't the case anymore. In late May, beginning of June, they had a storm that came in the middle of the night and created probably one of the worst flash floods I've ever seen in my life. It started in a small town called Manville with a population of 100. The emergency manager found out right away people in Manville were okay. I mean, houses were underwater, but the water was rushing downstream to Lusk. The emergency manager and the sheriff's office was able to get down to Lusk in time, get people out of their houses. And the fact, I mean, how many people have had to, do we have any law enforcement people here? Maybe when you tell people to evacuate their houses, do they ever go? He's shaking his head. Before I even asked, he shook his head no. Every single one of these people left, which we've never seen, but they all left. And it's a good thing they did. There were no deaths during this flood, which they expected, the nature of it, that there should have been. This flood hit Lusk at 3 o'clock in the morning, but these people in this hardened, isolated town knew that they wouldn't be asking them to leave for no reason, and they did. So what happened, I mean, these are the numbers, right? 18 homes destroyed, 30 sustained major damage. The total of minor and affected homes, I think, was 74, and there were 120 homes, and all that had received some level of damage, which, was this the biggest disaster that we've ever seen? No, absolutely not, right? I mean, you can look at floods across the country, but when you look at the population compared to, here's 120 homes and 40 of which are completely destroyed or majorly damaged, it's a huge percentage. And it rocked their world. It was heart-wrenching. From my perspective, man, so I was sitting in Riverton, Wyoming, minding my own business. We got a phone call saying, crap has hit the fan in Lusk, and there's a flood, and we're like, whatever, it's June, flooding happens all the time, no big deal. And that was absolutely the mindset and the perspective across the state at that point. We're like, okay, great, like, let us know if you need anything, right? We can send our teams, or we can open up a shelter if you decide you need that. About 2 hours later, we really got the phone call. And they said, we need somebody here as soon as you can. And I said, okay, fine, I'll leave my class. It was a 6-hour drive for me. So I drove the 6 hours into Lusk, got to the edge of Lusk, and I was like, what on earth are these people whining about? What's going on here? I did have to take the long way around because the road was closed. When I got into town, that's when I realized that 4 of the 5 access points into the town were completely washed out. You can see this bridge up here in the top right corner. Anybody, Department of Transportation, that's like a big problem. That's their main highway in and out of town. Access point to the Black Hills, it literally cut their town in half. So now that access point is completely gone. And I get down towards the downtown area, in a town of 1,500 people. Okay, it took like an extra 2 blocks to drive that far. But I get down there and you can see the water lines that are about 5 or 6 feet high on all of their downtown businesses. Most of the water was gone at this point, right? I mean, I got there within 12 hours probably of the flood, but most of the water was gone. That's how fast it went. The flood started from this creek. You could walk over it, you could step over it on a good day. And this is what it turned into. So I found myself going down to the incident command post at the county fairgrounds, right? Very fitting in small town Wyoming. And I walk in and it was chaos. It was absolute chaos. And I walked in and it was like I got accosted by people. Like, what do we do about this? And we need a shelter, we need food, we need donations management, and people are trying to do this, and people are already donating money, and volunteers want to help, and all the power's out, and there's no potable water, there's no showers, we don't have access to transportation. And I was like, hold the phone. Like, what is going on here? And that's what I walked into. So, granted, I'm the only Red Crosser on scene at this point, right? We had a team of 3 volunteers that joined me. And we were it for the first 3 days. The Homeland Security, the Wyoming Office of Homeland Security, sent a team to come help support, and the military was able to send their civil support team, which provided some of their operational support, as well as some of their guard troops to help do some of the immediate debris removal that had to be done. I suddenly became a specialist in all the things I wasn't a specialist in. And I found myself trying to coordinate donations management, manage the warehouse, open up the shelter, do all of these different things. And I don't say that because I saved the day. I assure you the opposite is true. But I do tell you that because it really sets the stage for what we dealt with after that. So what were we actually dealing with? It's a small town, right? Everybody knows everybody. Obviously that has its own set of unique challenges. Tunnel vision and operations management. I could not believe some of the discussions I heard when I walked in to incident command. They were talking about so-and-so's ranch and only talking about that for 20 minutes as opposed to here's this whole, how are we going to get these access roads open back up, or how are we going to reinstate power? The tunnel vision. And in a small town, can you blame them? I mean, right, that's what they were trained to do. They'd been living this beautiful, retired, peaceful life, and then they were thrown into this. Accessibility, like I mentioned, was an issue in public health. The water wasn't potable for over a week there, and that obviously presented its challenges. The other thing that's probably terrifying, I just said that incident command is the language of emergency management, right? There was no IAP for over a week. There was no incident there was an incident commander when I got on scene, but there was no operations chief, there was no planning chief, there was no logistics, there was nobody even thinking about financial records at this point, and that, it made my heart stop. It was terrifying to see the lack of that. The emergency manager there had gotten the job 6 months earlier as a part-time position and had no training. So, look, truly, he was an incredible man with a daunting task ahead of him. And how I mentioned government implications here. His role, the emergency manager, I said he was part-time. He was the county emergency manager, but he was hired by the city. So you think of the governmental, loopholes and who's your boss and so it was another kind of lesson learned to try to sort out a lot of those details beforehand. So what did we actually learn through all of this? The good news was at the end, some of the greatest successes we've ever seen from VOAD happened out of this incident. I was the VOAD chair at the time, but I knew I was moving to Utah. So I had already reached out to our vice chair, and he was already supporting and helping me through this entire process. He came on scene, and we worked like crazy to mobilize the community into a recovery committee. It started as kind of like a pseudo-recovery committee and then really evolved into the long-term recovery group. And again, Brooks did an incredible job supporting that, and I'm not just saying that to stroke his ego because he's in the back of the room, but without their support, we would have been dead in the water, without a doubt. It was really important for us to know our roles and responsibilities beforehand. It was really hard for me and Red Cross to come in and have them, Red Cross assumed that I could do everything and they were getting mad at me because I wasn't getting my reports in. And well, you're not getting anybody else to help you until you get your reports. And I'm drowning, literally, right? I'm trying to do all of these things, but there wasn't clarity in roles and expectations. So I extend that challenge to our VOAD agencies as well as our emergency managers. You may think you live in utopia, but I will say that the second you think that, you don't. So please take the time to identify those roles and responsibilities, right? That's a plan, that's coordination, that's knowing who does what, that's making relationships. All of those things contribute into that first thing. Second, allow no single point of failure. I was absolutely the point of failure those first 4 days in Lusk. I was sleeping in a cot behind a desk in the fairgrounds without a shower for 5 days, running a warehouse, and then people decided they had to bring their animals too. I forgot to mention that earlier. So then I was feeding goats at night. And one person cannot do that. And no matter the size of your community, whether it's 1,500 or 15,000 or 150,000, it's really important to make sure that you share the responsibility so no one person gets weighed down by a single job. And that really bolsters the importance of VOAD, right? That you need to have these multiple agencies coming into support so they can actually fill the niche that they are designed to fill. The third one truly is engage VOAD and that FEMA VAL as soon as you can. Trust me, you're gonna want us there. I know that there's some people who think that, struggling through volunteers isn't worth the effort, but I go back to it's the return on investment. It may take a little bit to get used to us and meet us and know our names, but at the end, it works. Brooks actually wrote a really great white paper explaining the importance of this process. After this experience, it's wonderful. I mean, it talks about how being able to get the VALs to meet the VOAD agencies and you as emergency managers and state emergency management beforehand facilitates their entry even sooner. Our long-term recovery group in Lusk was set up in 48 days. That's crazy. I mean, in some places it's taken upwards of 6 months to be able to do that, but we attribute that because of the influence that the FEMA Voluntary Agency Liaison and VOAD had in that community. And fourth, know who you're gonna need to call. We all know that communications and having accurate contact lists is so important, but truly it cannot be overemphasized. It's worth whatever effort it takes to be able to know who you need to call and when you're going to need to call them. So the call to action truly is that VOAD agencies, we need to train our volunteers, hone those skills, learn ICS, and we need to be realistic with our capabilities, and we need to know our emergency management partners. Emergency managers, it's imperative, please invite us to participate in your exercises and give us a seat at your EOC. I said, we're not that bad to work with, I promise, and it will be worth the benefit that it brings to you in the end. So if you guys have any questions about, what happened in Lusk, I breezed through it really quickly, but I hope that gives you a sense of what disasters can do in small towns that are unprepared, but that what can happen when proper planning and coordination actually happens and comes to fruition. Joeva's contact information certainly is the first. She's the chair here. She is your go-to, and she's incredible. She can do anything. You laugh, but it's true. I lived in her apartment when I first moved here because I didn't even have a place to stay, so she takes in homeless people too. I'm the Mountain West VOAD chair. Feel free to contact me with anything you have, but we have, I think, 5 minutes or so, 5 or 10 minutes. I'd love to answer any questions you guys have regarding the Lusk incident or anything else. Yeah, Ken.
Maybe just an experience about involving VOAD in your exercises. As an emergency manager for San Francisco, we have an exercise this time where we bring a pod exercise, where we have water brought in, we have all kinds of residents there. We have to do the emergency operations center. The Salvation Army came and provided a canteen for the workers of the emergency operations.
The Salvation Army came and provided the canteen for the workers at the Emergency Operations Center. The LDS Church provided food for the Southern Baptists who came to our pod program, which was at a park in Sandy, and fed all the volunteers. Aries came and provided communication between the pod and the Emergency Operations Center. As the emergency manager, I would attend the VOAD meetings, the monthly VOAD meetings, and got to know these folks. And it just underscored your point about establishing a relationship and including. I was so almost shocked at how willing they were to be involved in our exercises and put forth the time and the money they needed to be involved in our exercise. So just to underscore your point about exercises, because we don't have that many disasters. And so it's good to include them in the exercises.
I couldn't possibly agree with you more. Thank you. Any other questions or comments that I can help address? Does this make sense? Does it make sense to, I mean, especially those of you that didn't even know what VOAD was at the beginning, because I know that I've kind of brushed over it very quickly, but I hope that at least gives you an idea of what you're looking at. Is that, I hope, as we continue through this conference tomorrow, as we move closer to the great shakeout, as we wake up every morning with this unnatural fear of this earthquake, I hope that we take these opportunities to truly work with our emergency management partners from us as a VOAD standpoint, and for you guys to work with us as well. I said we want to go to the party, right? We want to go to the exercises, and we know that sometimes it can be daunting, right? The job of an emergency manager is varied, it's huge, it's difficult, but our only objective is to help you do what you do. So please reach out to us, get to know us. Volunteers, whether, this is a sad reality, but it's a great reality, and that is whether you want them or not, volunteers are going to show up on your doorstep during a disaster. So if you let the volunteers that you can trust beforehand help you, we can help mitigate that afterward. So that'll be my last shameless pitch. But if there's no other questions. Oh. Turn this over to Joy, but she's going to explain the region setup really quick, just so you guys can know where you're affiliating based on what county you're associated with here in Utah.
So Region 1, we follow the same region program as FEMA. Region 1, Laura, you want to stand up? Laura Lewis set up Region 1, and they have their meetings once a month in Ogden. If you are interested or have someone, a representative up there that you'd like to have join that group, you can give Laura a card and she'll put you on the email list. We have a Region 2, a very strong region, actually, that was originally set up by Ken Crowdy. And that's a huge, great group, really great. They have a monthly meeting, and then we have Region 4 in St. George. That's kind of, we're trying to find a new lead for that. It was set up by Paul Dunstan, who was with the Red Cross, who's no longer with the Red Cross. So it looks like it's going to be Linda Trujillo with the Southern Utah Food Bank, and she'll be kind of the lead down there. She's awesome. But if you have an interest or you have people in those areas or in another region, we invite you please to either contact Amber or myself. We'll get you, Carrie is our secretary for the state, and we can get you on the email list for the meetings. And the state has a meeting once a month. Our next meeting's next Tuesday. We have lots and lots of resources. I mean, VOAD has its own satellite phones. They were donated by the LDS Church, so we have 8 satellite phones. We have chainsaws. We have blue tarp people. We have long-term recovery Mennonite people that go in and habitat that furnish supplies and build and rebuild. We have an amazing, amazing group of people in this organization. So they're mostly background checked. So you don't have to worry about that. When you're setting up a volunteer reception center through Carrie's group, You Serve Utah, they will vet spontaneous volunteers that come in, and they'll match them up with a VOAD group. So that group is actually coordinating those individuals. It really is a very smooth system, and we definitely invite you to check it out.
All right. Thank you, Joy Beth. All right, get out of here. I know we're holding you after 5, and all you're thinking about is that your workday is over 15 minutes ago. So thank you for sticking around for the last session, and we'll see you guys around tomorrow.